Hi, everyone. This is Kovid back with an exclusive episode of Beyond the Code by Typo. With us today, we have a tech leader who has more than a decade of experience in the tech industry. She has been leading engineering teams at CircleCI, CI. She herself has been a SaaS startup co-founder. But her passion for tech industry doesn't end here. She's currently serving as a tech leadership coach for many organizations with her expertise in building great teams across the globe. So welcome to the show, Lena. Honored to have you here.
Thank you so much, Kovid. It's exciting to be here.
Great. You know what, Lena? In the last 8 months of building Beyond the Code as a community, starting with these podcasts, I've gotten an opportunity to talk with many engineering leaders like you here. And honestly, when I talk to them about engineering metrics and different other topics, particularly what I discovered that engineering metrics was something that they were not comfortable talking about. So we used to touch on topics like DORA and all. So they were not very comfortable around that. However, like when I read your LinkedIn post and your articles about engineering metrics, I was like completely moved by the depth you had and like the hands-on experience you had with implementing these engineering metrics. So honestly, today's podcast topic, which is impact of engineering metrics on engineering success, I couldn't think of a better guest than you. So thank you so much once again to be here. And I'm sure people are going to love this and get to learn a lot of things that they need to implement these engineering metrics in their organization.
Thank you. And I honestly will say that, similar to what you've described, the articles I end up writing are rooted in the questions I hear from people. And also, honestly, a lot of questions that I've grappled with. And I got into tech in 2010 and already had a previous career in finance before that. And it's not like I got into the space and had it all figured out from the get-go. And so I'm glad it was practical and helpful, and I hope we can get a lot of that today as well.
Sure, I'm sure about that. Cool. So, once we get started, it will be all about the engineering metrics. But before I jump into that, I would want the audience to know you a little bit more. So, if you're comfortable sharing something about yourself as a person, what you do, what you love, I would be more than happy to hear that.
So I'm just by the room around me. I think for the people who are watching this, you can probably tell a bunch of things about me. I love books. You can see like behind me in the shelf, I have a lot of leadership books, but the row at the bottom is actually cookbooks and baking books. I'm especially fond of making pastry and breads. I
Nice.
have, but you can't see, I have a plant or a couple of plants actually standing right in front of me behind the camera. I have too many plants, but it's become a really fun hobby. I've always loved gardening, and now that I live in the city, that's the limit of garden that I have, but I really enjoy it. And I also do a lot of sort of creative things. I paint, I weave, I knit, and do a lot of other sort of textile works. And I think that's about it. I also love just being outside in the nature. Fortunately, I live very close to a park, which is really helpful to like escape city life a bit. Yeah, those are some of the things that I do, and a lot of that time I also just spend, thinking about the work that I do, because I really enjoy it, and because I really am passionate about, helping people navigate the complexity that comes with like engineering leadership roles. And so, running my own business now, I also still try to take breaks. So, like art and all of those things help me with that. But it's still something that's on my mind a lot.
Absolutely impressive. I'm sorry, but I was just going through your LinkedIn profile and I saw that you transitioned from a finance role, then you were a community member and then like community builder. So there is a lot of transition, and I'm sure the versatility of the choices that you have here, I can understand.
Yeah, well,
Great, Lena.
I always say like I'm just a very curious person by nature, and I've said yes to a lot of things in my life, often without having it all figured out. So that's that makes for an interesting CV, but also for a lot of fun. But at the same time, I also maintain a list of hobbies that I want to take on once I have the time. So I'm also never have enough time for all the things that I'm curious about. It's a bit of a struggle, but it's a good one to have.
No, that's cool. I think this is amazing and great to know you, Lena.
Thank you.
All right, let's get started. I think before we jump into the engineering metrics directly, my first question it all starts with dev operations, right? DevOps that we say. So before we jump into how we measure DevOps, let's talk about what is DevOps in brief. What do you think? What is DevOps in brief? And then what engineering metrics, DORA metrics look like, a bit on that. Yeah.
Um, the in brief part is interesting about it. So I will say the way I like to. So I've been doing a lot of work with, for example, corporations that are trying to integrate DevOps culture or become more agile, not just in an agile with a capital A sense, but more just in terms of their ability to handle change. And to me, that's ultimately what it's about. I mean, the DevOps movement and agile in particular, I see as huge pillars of this, especially in tech. They originated out of the idea of coming out of a separation between software development and IT infrastructure towards basically integrating those things. That's where the kind of development and operations DevOps part is coming from. But to me, what's most important there is ultimately it's about businesses' ability to not just handle change in the sense of being reactive, responsive to changes that are going on in the business world or just changes that are needed in the software development process at a much more granular level. But the idea that businesses need to ultimately be able to innovate, to drive change, to create change, and not just, again, at a strategic level, but just in every team in the organization, in everyone who's working with them. And that's where having practices where teams can ultimately, I'll talk a lot about teams, by the way, because I found that especially in software engineering, teams are ultimately the core unit where work gets done.
Yeah.
I don't believe in putting too much emphasis in the sense of stress responsibilities on the individual, just because software development is in a lot of parts a highly collaborative process. It's where the best results are coming from. That also still means you need highly skilled individuals, but not the idea of sort of hero culture and all that. So I'll talk a lot about teams probably today. And so the ability for a team to have ideas, put those ideas into motion, get that work prioritized and ultimately get things shipped. Like a lot of that is inherently tied to DevOps culture and the idea that change ideas, innovation aren't just generated by, your executive team, but anyone can ultimately bring in the subject matter expertise they have and then make things happen. Sounds quite basic, especially if you work in a company that does a lot of those practices. It may be, your day to day already, and that's great. But for a lot of companies, that's still a process that they're going through. And even for teams that are, working more at the forefront of DevOps agility, those things, there's still often impediments. Like you're depending on other teams is a classic, or you have security concerns that you need to work through. And so but ultimately, yes. So in my favorite description of it, ultimately DevOps is about making change easier and making change as frictionless as possible for anyone involved in the company.
Absolutely. I think the underlying fundamental, probably, even if a lot of teams and organizations know that this needs to be done, implementing it is also a very big challenge. So
Yes.
I'm sure, I mean, I've been part of a few companies in my career and I know how it looks like when the manager is talking about all those values and principles that we need to like stick to. But when it comes to work, we are doing nothing. Like the innovation is missing, the context of the customer is missing, and then how to collaborate well, make things frictionless amongst the team is something that we really, really need to deep dive and understand and actually believe while doing the work. So it totally makes
Yeah,
sense.
that's the fun
That's
part,
it.
right?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. All right. I think this is a very important and a very good start to our discussion. But how much important do you think that when these processes are in place, teams are following it, or let's say trying to follow it, uh, how important do you think these DORA metrics play an important role there? What should be the motivation for any team to have these metrics in place, first of all?
So I think DORA metrics to me are, first of all, I think they're really helpful, but I also think they're a bit of a problem, and I'll explain why. My approach is always that ultimately teams need to have visibility into basically the work that they're doing. Like you need to know, how are your services performing? How are you doing as a team? How are your practices working? Like that's really important. Like one of the cornerstones of DevOps culture is the ability to learn from mistakes. It's really important. And so in order to be able to learn, you need to know how you're doing. And I love how you just described earlier the idea between basically the breakdown between the abstract ideals in DevOps culture, for example, versus the day-to-day reality. Because a lot of the things that you and I may end up saying today will probably sound very basic and very simple. And we all know that it's not. Making those things actually happen can be really hard. And that's kind of the joy of it, but also sometimes the frustration. And so, and so basically, and that's why I also like to start often with what are we even trying to do there? DORA metrics are one tool to help you have that visibility to know how your team is doing and to get better over time. I emphasize that quite a lot because we have a bit of a tendency in tech. I mean, I do it too, that we end up making the tool the goal, where it doesn't become any more about, for example, hey, we want visibility, therefore DORA metrics can be a great tool to help with that. They're also not the only tool. But especially I found in the discourse about metrics over the last 10 years, it's very easy to make the tool the thing where, the conversation then is, oh, we need DORA metrics. We really need DORA metrics. And we tend to forget a little bit why. And that's one bit that I find really important. DORA metrics aren't just the solution in and of themselves. They are a tool to help you, get the visibility your team needs and to understand how you can get better and whatnot. And that part I find really important. And that also means DORA metrics may not be the right tool for your team. One thing that I have seen a lot is that in the discourse about engineering productivity and developer productivity, we've often forgotten that there are other departments around engineering. And now DORA metrics specifically, I think they can be really helpful for developers and engineers to understand, what are the impediments in the software development process? Where are we inefficient? Where are we not effective or as effective as we could be? Efficiency more towards the deployment frequency, getting changes out quickly. Effectiveness is then more about, are we achieving our goals? Are we actually hitting, for example, the quality which is baked into DORA that we need? That's important. The problem is that a lot of people outside of engineering don't understand DORA metrics. And honestly, they kind of shouldn't have to. Because ultimately, DORA metrics, or, take the SPACE framework or a lot of DevX discussions that have been going on lately. There are a lot of different ways to look at developer productivity out there. What I'm trying to say there is essentially that there is an important discussion, and I like to call that metrics for teams, metrics that are to help a team understand how are we doing. They have the subject matter expertise to understand, the impact of deployment frequency, for example. And at the same time, you also need to have conversations with people outside of engineering and convey to them how your productivity is. And if you're able to translate DORA metrics really well, say for your finance person or for the people who are making the budgets for your engineering department, DORA metrics can still be helpful. But if you're working with people who aren't super technical, you may have to translate DORA metrics for them in order to represent engineering productivity, because those are two different basically problems to solve. One problem is helping a team get better. The other problem is essentially conveying to others how productive your team is. And again, DORA metrics can be really helpful with that. But keep in mind basically what you're actually trying to do and what goal you're trying to pursue there.
Makes sense. Lena, can you give some example? You just touched upon this point, if someone has the expertise, subject matter expertise to understand what is deployment frequency, only then it would make sense for somebody to understand its essence and probably abide by things that metric is telling and improve in that direction. So can you give such examples maybe for the cycle time, the lead time per change, or change failure rate, which are basically the DORA matrix here? Can you give us some examples there?
Sorry, I don't think I quite. What kind of examples are you looking for? Because you mentioned a couple really good metrics already around DORA.
Yeah, so I'm looking for an example where people would want to implement, let's say, deployment frequency as as a metric to understand teams are doing good or not, and then translating that into uh, a communication basically for a team which is outside of engineering maybe. So just an example of a metric where teams are understanding how it is being done, why it is being done. Does
Thank you.
that? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Um, so I'll stick with deployment frequency. Like one, not just hypothesis, like there's research behind the DORA metrics, and it's incredibly good research, is that ultimately if you have smaller changes, you're going to increase the ability of a team to handle change. And so one motivation to look at deployment frequency and like implement that as part of DORA can just be you want with your team to get better at like making faster changes. You want to, for example, go from just shipping one big merge request, pull request per month to like smaller changes to make them more digestible, to help your teams maybe, collaborate a bit more. There can often also be an element of knowledge sharing. So those can be some motivations for you looking at deployment frequency. And ideally, of course, you have deployment frequency increase over time. I'm
Right.
looking at trying to visualize the graphs in my head. And now that you have that as a team, you can learn from the observations you're making there. You can make process improvements internally. It's really helpful to just, look at that metric once a week during your planning meeting or during your retros, talk about what are we doing? How is the metric moving? What are we going to do about that? And I found that this bit is always really critical to make space for the team to not just look at a metric, but also figure out what action they want to take, because otherwise it's at some point it just gets demotivating and frustrating. Like if you're seeing a metric that's trending in the wrong direction every week and no one has the time to do anything about that, well, that's just going to suck. And
Right.
so to the second part of your question in terms of how do you then communicate this? I mean, honestly, if you're an engineering manager and you're reporting up through a CTO, your CTO will likely understand these metrics, why they're important. So they may also be able to have, some of those conversations with outside stakeholders. But in terms of conveying the impact of this, honestly, your outside stakeholders probably care about, are we achieving our goals in engineering? What are we doing to get better at achieving our goals? And are we not wasting money in the process? Those are usually the typical questions that business stakeholders care about. Because, I mean, ultimately, if you're an engineering leader, that's also kind of your job to care about.
Right.
And so that's the conversation you can have. You can say, hey, we are achieving our goals, ideally, and we are measuring how efficient we're being in this process by looking at something called deployment frequency. Deployment frequency means XYZ. It ultimately is a signal to us that we're able to handle change faster. And you can also see as a result, our ability to hit our goals has become better, or our ability to identify risks. Those things. It's not a super big translation effort necessarily. Just because
Yeah.
you don't rely on just saying DORA
Yeah.
alone, but build a
Absolutely.
little bit of context around it.
Right. I think it's more about to whom we are talking to, and
Yes,
accordingly, we'll
exactly.
have to translate those metrics into that context.
Yeah.
And one more thing that I feel is that outside of engineering, anyone whom you talk to, whether it is product or let's say even sometimes you're talking to the sales teams also. So you have to give them a clarity on what exactly is going on in terms of achieving goals. So do you think is there a way around where we can have metrics beyond DORA that even the engineering team relates to and uh, works on it? So, for example, something like deliverability of the team, can
Mhm.
it be mapped to some metrics which business and engineering teams both understand? Like something
Mm.
like maybe customer satisfaction?
Yeah. I've run a lot of product engineering departments over the years. And ideally, of course, you have goals that are ultimately about customer satisfaction or specific access to new features, capabilities in your product, and you're able to map your engineering work to that. Um, that's great. If you're able to say, hey, we're going to contribute to company revenue goals, also great. And sometimes you just have to kind of weave a bit of a longer thread there. So, for example, to say, you mentioned deliverability, like in the sense of like cycle time or lead time. ultimately, a big part, honestly, of using metrics effectively is figuring out what is the picture you want to paint and what is the narrative you want to convey. So, for example, say one of your company's goals is highly relevant to a lot of people at the moment is like become more efficient. Well, what does efficiency mean for your team? Where are things inefficient right now? Like, for example, you had the deployment frequency example earlier. We're currently, like, your assessment of your team, also ideally have a conversation with your team so you can look at, like, sit together with them, say, okay, we have a corporate goal to become more efficient. Where are things not as efficient as they could be? In our case, for example, we're only able to really deploy once a month. There are reasons for that. I'm sure you're doing that because there are some impediments. But what are those impediments? What would clearing those impediments do for the business? And similarly, if the company can on that efficiency goal, maybe there are things in your process that are really difficult. For example, a case a lot of teams are dealing with is that knowledge silos. You have only, one or two people who have core knowledge on the team. Distributing that knowledge is going to, over time, make things a bit more efficient. And so look at the big company goals that you're getting and then understand what do those actually mean for our team. And honestly, that's already a really impactful connection to have because, of course, not everyone in, say, your finance department is going to understand like a deployment frequency, but people understand knowledge silos. And
Yeah.
people also understand if you're basically saying, hey, we have this specific thing in engineering, for example, where if our cycle time is shorter, or even if our lead time is shorter, we're able to respond to customer feedback faster.
Yes.
Just spin the narrative a little bit further, and people are going to get that. So basically,
Absolutely.
draw the connections for people between like the high level things that your company cares about and what they mean for your team.
Totally makes sense. I think this is one important aspect of how you communicate these metrics and translate them into something that looks like success, not only for the outside engineering team, but also for the engineering teams. But
Mhm.
talking about engineering success, I think there is not just one aspect that we can say, okay, this is something that how engineering teams would succeed, looking at the metric of, let's say, uh, having customer satisfaction or customer retention, or relating that to epic cycle time kind of things where you are delivering fast to, or responding fast to the feedback they're getting. I think there are other important aspects to an engineering success. Uh, Team satisfaction holds very, very big importance there, I believe. What's your thought on that, and how do you, as an engineering leader, measure it or not measure it, and how are you going to do it basically?
Mhm. I sigh a little bit because I think this one is such a really important and at the moment especially such a difficult conversation to have. I want to just briefly zoom out in terms of where we came from in the discourse of developer satisfaction, team satisfaction. Just one cornerstone from my personal beliefs and beliefs as an engineering leader, like, team satisfaction is important. There's very good research that shows that um, developers having good connection to mission and vision, the good feedback culture on the team, like all the high performing teams research that's been done by Edmondson and others, it's incredibly important. I also believe in just like we're working with humans, right? And treating each other as well as possible is an important part of that. At the same time, again, team satisfaction is a tool. We're not just caring about team satisfaction because we want people to do well. And I say that more in the business context now. But there is a point because it helps us get things done, because it helps us build great teams. It helps us build a sustainable company, all of those things. And so, like with any other metrics, I found that it really helps the conversations you're having with other leaders in your company, even within engineering, when we're talking about why are we measuring those things and why are they really important. And all morals and personal values and leadership values and all of that I have aside, which I ultimately to me are the reason why I'm doing this work. But it also means, just to say it very bluntly, if you go to your finance person and just say, hey, we care about team satisfaction, they're probably going to say, well, team satisfaction, like your team satisfaction is very, very expensive compared to the team satisfaction in, for example, our sales teams, where people often get paid just largely commission based on the impact that they're having for the company, or compared to the customer success teams that you may have. And over the last couple of years, we've, as an industry, when money was still cheap, before the layoff rounds that we're going through now, a lot of team satisfaction was also about ultimately retaining talent. Engineering talent was hard to find and was hard to retain. A lot of companies are putting way less emphasis on that right now. I personally think team satisfaction is still really important. All that research on high-performing teams and whatnot still holds. But at the moment, for a lot of companies, the bottom line really matters. How much money you're spending really, really matters. And so that means, as an engineering leader, should you care about team satisfaction, how your developers are doing? I personally think 100% you should. And you should look at how are you ultimately, helping people grow in their careers? Are you helping them actually have the impact that they can have on the business? And the latter is the conversation you need to have. So a lot of components of team satisfaction are ultimately about, alignment, for example, or about having business impact. But a lot of the metrics around team satisfaction are, more about feedback culture, for example. So again, look at team satisfaction, look at developer engagement, developer happiness and productivity, and connect those things to business metrics, connect them to, translate them into examples that the people outside of engineering will understand and will care about. So, look at the team satisfaction components, depending on what you're measuring there. For example, that is that engineers are aligned with the mission of your company, or that there are no knowledge silos, or that there's high business impact of the work that your teams are doing. So, these components of team satisfaction are really important. Connect them to things that are meaningful to your business, because especially at the moment, it's just going to help you have more productive conversations. Because again, like right now, that's what a lot of businesses care about. And that still means, again, developer satisfaction is still really important. Just figure out how you can talk about it in a way that's going to resonate with the people around you.
I think the biggest problem here is that a lot of engineering leaders might be knowing about this, might be reading about this on day-to-day basis. But the challenge is when it comes to implementation, they are stuck, right? And I think we are circling back to the point one where we were talking about that uh, knowing things and then believing and implementing things at work is something that is very, very difficult. So, in your vast experience so far with different engineering teams, I'm sure you would have seen a lot of such challenges that engineering leaders or teams in general at every level encounter while implementing these metrics. Uh, can you just share your experience, maybe one or two examples where you could highlight how people ended up implementing these metrics and what challenges they faced during that course? How much time did it take, so that we can set some real expectations for the audience who is listening and really wanting to implement these things?
Yeah, I love that question. So my first recommendation would be, and I'm going to try and formulate recommendations based on things that I know people often struggle with. Do this with your team. So what ends up happening often is that there's a business demand for, better visibility, more metrics and whatnot. And a lot of engineers are scared because they've made bad experiences, and understandably so. And so that's where my whole angle of metrics for teams is coming in. So sit down with your team, say, I would love for us to better understand how we're doing, to improve together in this and make it a group effort. I'm pretty sure your developers will have ideas for things that are not going well. Because it's going to bug them in their daily work. And so the more you involve them in this already, the better. So that's a really good cornerstone. The second part, that's more the metrics kind of about teams that you may need for business reporting and whatnot. Be transparent about those. Say, hey, my boss is asking me to talk to them on a weekly basis about the impediments in our delivery or our goal progress. You can share those reports with your teammates as well. While you're, pushing more information to your boss and giving them the visibility that they need. Similarly, if you're getting questions from stakeholders from the business side or from customer success, help your teammates by just sharing those things to the degree that you can. Because honestly, many of us have struggled over the last years because, I mean, I come from the business background initially, but a lot of engineers never got business training, and, became engineering managers and weren't given even just the vocabulary for having conversations about efficiency and effectiveness and whatnot. And so, like, you may still have to learn some of that, and that's okay. I have a couple guides on my site as well, if you want to get more into that. But at the same time, you can use that as a great opportunity to help your engineers understand a bit more of a business background, things to think about, and a lot of, basically framing and vocabulary, that translation function that we talked about. So that's basically the second piece. Keep your engineers in the loop on this. Be transparent with reporting and metrics, and with the cases you're making. I think another part that I found is really helpful is collaborate really closely with your product partners. Like if you have, if your team has a product manager, if they don't, if you run a platform team, for example, you may have more of that function yourself, where you need to write business cases for the investments that you're making. But like having run product engineering organizations, I just see a lot that honestly, the collaboration between product and engineering can be really tough. And that's oftentimes really, really making things very difficult for everyone involved. And I know that there's often, like incentives that aren't aligned well and whatnot. If you can partner well with your product team or product manager, that's going to go a really long way. Figure out how you can set goals that are aligned, because the whole, engineering wants to do this, but product wants to do something else. I understand where it's coming from, and it's causing so much frustration and so much friction on so many teams, and ultimately impeding your ability to create business impact. And so if you're having troubles in those relationships, work with your boss, work with your product partner to figure out, ultimately you're all there to do good work for the business. How can you collectively work together to make that happen? And then lastly, on the metrics topic, what I would also say is if you're just getting started, and you're, not measuring a lot, or there are a couple metrics in place and you're not sure what to do with them, I always recommend, go to basics. Figure out where are we struggling as a team, work with your teammates, work with your boss as well. They may have things that they want from your team, or you have a corporate strategy. I mentioned earlier, there are strategic goals potentially in place around becoming more efficient or becoming more agile as an organization. Look at how can we do those things as a team. And then if you don't have metrics in place yet, how can we measure those things?
Yeah.
We all love a good dashboard. Resist the temptation to measure, 20 things from the get-go, because worst case, it's just going to be overwhelming. And again, like you're not going to have the capacity to actually address all of those things. So like instead, start small, to use 2 to 3 metrics that really capture areas that are meaningful to your team, that are meaningful to your business, and then iterate from there. Like you may not need all metrics that you start with at every point in time. At some point, something else is going to become more important. You can focus on that. The really important part really is that you look at those metrics regularly. You talk to your team, you talk to your boss, and you figure out how you can make room. And that's also to the collaboration with product. You make room for actually addressing the issues that you're observing in these metrics that you're looking at. And that honestly, I know a lot of it may sound really basic, but I also know that honestly, most of those things are things that any team struggles with at least at some point in time. And at the same time, it also means you're in good company and, it can be figured out. Like go back to those basics and don't get too lost in, like, oh, you really need to measure DORA or space or DevX or something else. Figure out what your company and your team needs and what's meaningful to them. And if you need a starting point, DORA is a good starting point. I also don't want to just trash on those metrics.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I totally understand that this is very basic or something being mentioned every now, here and then. But one very important point that you have mentioned that I feel is that the metrics are not something that are same for everyone. Every team has their own needs. And having a collaboration with all the stakeholders is, I think, the must. Because what I have also felt in my journey of learning about these metrics and getting them implemented is the resistance. One is, of course, the innate resistance of not understanding and where to implement it, but then the resistance from the teams, the cross-functional teams. So it's a very, very good point, actually, Lena, that you just mentioned, that talking to your bosses, talking to the cross-functional teams, talking to the developers, and making them understand what exactly is needed and why it is needed will bring that alignment in place. And of course, I mean, it would take some time. And what we are doing right now here is talking about it and setting some real expectations. Because if somebody who's new to this and they think that, okay, I would do it in 1 month, but the realistic thing is that it would take 3 months, right? It would take some time for everyone to come in the alignment and then get it implemented. So while we are talking about this, someone who is hearing it would understand that, okay, it will take 3 months of time. These are the things that I should do. These are the things I should not do. And then implement these basics to get the results there. And I'm sure I have seen those case studies. I've seen those scenarios where the teams have really improved their efficiency, productivity, satisfaction, and became successful over a period of time using these metrics. So, uh, I do agree that this is basic, but this basic is something that needs a little bit of depth and context, or
Yeah.
the teams who are trying to implement it. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And I always say, like, I mean, we've all read the books and the blog posts and whatnot, and there are so many good guides out there. And at the same time, I mean, honestly, the work that I do is in translating those abstract, like
Yeah.
simple in the abstract things to, like, I always say, what do you do on Monday morning at 9 a.m. when you open your laptop? When you open your laptop and you're like, oh, I don't even know where to start. Like, that translation or that application is the tricky part. And that's why, um, even though it sounds so, like, yeah, rudimentary, but understanding why you're doing this. I love the way you just captured this as well. Like, why are we doing this? What is the point of this? Don't lose that thread. Because otherwise, again, at some point, all these tools just become self-serving. At some point, you're just, you're similar with, like, story points. At some point, you're just, going through story
Yeah.
points as a team because you've always done it. And just keep on doing it. And then developers get frustrated and things get annoying. Same thing with metrics. Don't lose the connection as to why you're doing those things, because one, it's going to help with, team satisfaction, employee engagement, but it's also going to make sure that you're still on the right path. Because if you keep sight of why are we measuring a certain thing, why are we talking about this in our retrospectives, you can also then have the conversation of, well, actually, DORA metrics aren't serving us anymore right now, because we're actually doing quite okay, and we need to shift to measuring more in the area of, make something up here,
Yeah.
in the area of like more agile metrics, or we need to measure a bit more, like focus a bit more on the effectiveness side of things, because we really need to add more metrics around quality that we're shipping or whatever it
Right.
is. But
Right.
it's going to help you, not just continue measuring DORA till infinity because you've started it at some point and now you're just doing it. It's like, don't forget that why. It's
Yeah. Of
probably my
course. I
biggest
think,
thing that I'd recommend.
no, I think that's really great. And with this, I think, in the interest of time, we will stop here, because otherwise we'll just keep on talking. We have a lot to share and discuss. Maybe we can have another episode on this, but for today,
Be happy
we will
to. Yeah.
we will take a pause here. And before departing, I would say, if there is one piece of advice that you would like to share with our engineering community, the leaders who are listening to us, the engineering managers who are listening to us, please go ahead.
I would say, stick with the why, and context is really key. Like understanding why are we doing things, why are they important, like having that context yourself, and then helping your engineers understand it as well. Like, and you may have to talk about this context many times, and that's because it can change, but also because engineers will have to then wrap their head around what it means for them, for their job, and that why and that context is really critical, and it's going to help you like choose metrics thoughtfully, use them well with your teams, and not just as a tool to take surveillance, which they're often kind of abused as. And ultimately, that's how you'll also get the metrics to help you drive the positive change that your teams need. And when you start small and stick with the why, you're going to get there, even if it feels like a really big task when you're just getting started. But you'll be able to figure it out.
Right. And I think, if people who are listening to this are getting stuck anywhere, Lena is there. You can reach out to her.
Please do. Yes. That's
Cool. All right, Lena. It was a great talk. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your experiences with us. Lovely talking to you.
my pleasure. Thank you so much, Kovid.
See you.
Bye.